Hello. Settle in comfortably, wrap yourself up warmly, and let the gentle whisper of stories carry you into a deep, peaceful sleep. The wind howls, a relentless symphony of biting cold across the vast, pewter-coloured expanse of the North Sea. For the seafarers of the early medieval period, particularly those operating outside the sheltered fjords and coastal havens, winter was not merely an inconvenience, but an existential threat. Imagine standing on the deck of a 9th century longship, miles from land, the spray freezing instantly upon the rigging, and the very air ablaze against exposed skin. Evidence from archaeological finds such as the Oseberg ship burial, c. 834 AD, and the Skulderev wrecks, 11th century, reveals vessels primarily designed for speed and raiding, not necessarily for prolonged exposed winter voyages in open water. The average winter temperature across the North Sea region, particularly from October to March, frequently dropped below freezing, ranging from 0 degrees Celsius, 32 degrees Celsius, to 5 degrees Celsius, 23 degrees Celsius, in coastal areas, plunging significantly lower further out at sea. This harsh reality presented unique challenges for pirates, whose operations often extended beyond fair weather ambushes. Historians like Dr. H.R. Ellis Davidson have meticulously documented how logistical constraints, especially during the darker, colder months, dictated raiding patterns and naval movements. Food stores, largely non-perishable salted meats, dried fish, and fermented grains, provided essential calories, yet offered little warmth against the pervasive chill. Furthermore, the lack of sophisticated heating systems aboard these early vessels meant constant exposure. While some ships might have carried braziers for cooking or localized warmth, these were fire hazards on wooden vessels and impractical for widespread heating, especially in choppy seas. The primary defense against hypothermia was layered clothing. Wool, often lanolin-rich, provided insulation, and furs, when available, offered additional protection. Yet even with these precautions, frostbite and hypothermia were rampant, capable of debilitating an entire crew within hours of severe exposure. The necessity of maintaining a vigilant watch, even in the most brutal conditions, meant limited opportunities for continuous rest in the relative warmth of below-deck compartments, which themselves were rarely truly warm. Venturing below the open decks, the pirates sought refuge, not comfort. These cramped, often unventilated spaces, referred to in contemporary sagas as room or leer, offered only marginal improvement over the biting wind above. Imagine the stench. A potent cocktail of human body odor, damp wool, stale food, and bilge water, all trapped within the confines of a wooden hull, swaying violently with the North Sea swells. Archaeological reconstructions, informed by vessel remains like the Golterbeck ship, c. 1100 AD from Sweden, indicate minimal headroom and very limited designated sleeping areas for the bulk of the crew. Sleeping arrangements were rudimentary at best. The concept of individual bunks, as seen in later maritime eras, was largely absent. Instead, pirates often slept communally, huddled together on makeshift beds of straw, animal hides, or even simply directly on the ship's timbers. Sharing body heat, a fundamental survival strategy in extreme cold, was not a luxury but a necessity. Dr. Olaf Gulbitz, a specialist in early medieval textiles and clothing, highlights the critical role of personal bedding, often a heavy wool blanket or a fur pelt, which each sailor would carry as his primary insulator against the cold deck and ambient temperatures that rarely rose significantly above freezing, even below deck. The sheer number of men crammed into confined spaces did elevate the internal temperature slightly through metabolic heat, but this was often offset by poor insulation and constant drafts filtering through the hull. The sagas, though romanticized, occasionally offer glimpses into mundane shipboard life. The Omrin Langi Long Serpent saga, for instance, details crowded conditions, implicitly suggesting that personal space and undisturbed sleep were rare commodities. Furthermore, the constant need for vigilance meant that sleeping would occur in shifts, often broken and fitful. The persistent dampness, another pervasive element of life at sea, exacerbated the cold, making restful, restorative sleep an almost impossible achievement during the brutal medieval winters. Beyond the relentless chill and the constant damp, another assault on the senses permeated the winter voyage. The omnipresent and often overwhelming smell of rancid blubber, fish oil, and human refuse. While food provided essential sustenance, the preservation and consumption methods of the era contributed significantly to the ship's overall ambience. Imagine the challenge of keeping food fresh on a long voyage without refrigeration. The solutions were crude, but effective for survival, if not for olfactory pleasure. Archaeological finds from Viking-age settlements and shipwrecks, like those at Hedeby and Roskilde, consistently reveal containers used for storing large quantities of dried and salted fish, as well as barrels of blubber from whales and seals. This blubber, a high-calorie energy source vital for survival in extreme cold, was often rendered down into oil. This oil served multiple purposes: a cooking fat, a fuel for rudimentary lamps, and, critically, a supplement to the diet. However, once blubber began to spoil, its pungent acidic odor would permeate every corner of the ship, clinging to clothing, hair, and every surface, creating an atmosphere ripe for stomach-churning nausea. Professor Jan Bill, an expert in Viking shipbuilding and maritime culture, stresses that such odors were an unavoidable reality of early medieval sea travel, a testament to the harsh practicalities of life rather than any lack of hygiene by contemporary standards. The combination of this pervasive stink, combined with seasickness, often led to cramped and unsanitary conditions. Crew members would inevitably vomit, adding to the general miasma. The ship's bilge, a catch-all for runoff water, food scraps, and human waste, would become a festering pool, especially if not regularly pumped out. While some oral historical accounts of later periods hint at attempts to cleanse ships with vinegar or smoke, evidence for such practices on early medieval vessels is scarce, suggesting that endurance was the primary strategy. This constant, unpleasant sensory environment, alongside the biting cold and minimal rest, compounded the psychological toll on these early pirates, making mere survival a daily triumph. Beyond the stench and the physical discomfort, a more profound, disorienting presence defined winter sleep at sea: the relentless motion of the vessel. The North Sea, notorious for its unpredictable and often violent weather patterns, routinely subjected ships to powerful waves and punishing gales. Imagine trying to sleep as your entire world pitches and rolls, often through arcs of 30 degrees or more, accompanied by the groan of timbers and the crash of waves against the hull. The longships of the medieval era, while seaworthy for their time, lacked the deep keels and ballast of later sailing vessels, making them more susceptible to the violent motions of the open ocean. While this design made them agile for coastal raiding and riverine travel, it offered little stability in heavy seas. Expert naval architect and historian Gareth Williams emphasizes that these vessels were inherently lively platforms. Combined with the primitive sleeping arrangements, often directly on hard surfaces, The constant movement made deep, restorative sleep exceptionally difficult for the crew. Seasickness, already exacerbated by the cramped, odoriferous conditions, would become a common affliction, further disrupting attempts at rest. Historical accounts, such as those found in the Orkneyinga saga, occasionally describe harrowing sea journeys where crews were forced to bail continuously for days, leaving almost no time for sleep, highlighting the extraordinary resilience demanded of these mariners. The crew's limited space below decks, often shared with cargo, would transform into a chaotic tumble of bodies and belongings in a storm. Sailors would likely lash themselves to fixed points or wedge themselves tightly between cargo to prevent being thrown about. This constant physical stress, coupled with the ever-present threat of a rogue wave or structural failure, meant that even when sleeping, the body and mind remained in a state of heightened alert. The concept of sleeping with one eye open took on a literal and profound meaning in these unforgiving environments, demonstrating the relentless struggle for rest amidst the relentless fury of the winter sea. Beyond the immediate dangers of the elements and the discomfort of constant motion, the very fabric of daily life on a pirate vessel in medieval winter contributed significantly to the deprivation of quality sleep, personal hygiene, or rather, the stark absence of it. Imagine wearing the same dense wool garments, often damp, for weeks or even months on end, without the possibility of washing or even properly drying them. This was the grim reality for a pirate crew. The materials themselves, primarily wool, while excellent insulators, presented their own challenges. Unwashed wool, especially when damp, becomes a breeding ground for bacteria, leading to skin irritation, chafing, and a pervasive sour odor that clung to everyone and everything. Dr. Gail Owen Crocker, a leading scholar on Anglo-Saxon and Viking clothing, emphasizes that personal cleanliness standards of the period, while different from modern concepts, were still important on land. At sea, however, convenience and necessity dictated a severe reduction in such practices. Fresh water, a precious commodity, was reserved almost exclusively for drinking and limited cooking, never for bathing or extensive laundry. The consequences for sleep, beyond mere discomfort, were significant. Constant itching from unwashed clothes, salt-encrusted skin, and the inevitable presence of lice and fleas, transmitted easily in such close quarters, would have made restful sleep remarkably difficult. Evidence from shipwreck sites points to findings like combs, suggesting some attempt at grooming, but these were largely ineffective against such widespread infestations in a constantly damp, crowded environment. Even in moments of calm, relief from the physical torment of irritated skin and biting insects would have been fleeting. This continuous bodily discomfort added yet another layer to the severe sleep deprivation faced by these seafarers, transforming the dream of undisturbed rest into a distant, almost unattainable luxury. Despite the overwhelming physical discomforts, the unyielding cold, the pervasive stench, and the unsettling motion, the human mind still sought refuge in dreams. For the medieval pirate battered by the winter seas, these fleeting escapes offered a momentary reprieve, a psychological defense mechanism against the brutal reality of their existence. While we lack direct records of their dreams, understanding the human need for psychological escape provides critical insight into their inner world. The dreams of these seafarers would likely have been shaped by their harsh environment and their deepest desires. Imagine a pirate, cold to his bones, dreaming of the roaring hearth of a longhouse, the smell of wood smoke and roasted meat, the familiar warmth of land. Such visions, informed by collective memory and cultural narratives, would have provided a powerful, if temporary, mental sanctuary. Folklorist and mythologist Dr. Maria Quillhaug notes how dreams and the spirit world were often intertwined in Norse culture, suggesting these visions could have held deeper, almost spiritual significance for those facing constant danger. These vivid internal experiences, however brief, provided a stark contrast to their waking hours. The physiological impact of severe cold and sleep deprivation on cognitive function is well documented. Studies show impaired judgment, decreased reaction times, and increased irritability, all factors detrimental to shipboard efficiency and survival. The respite offered by dreams, therefore, would have been more than mere entertainment. It was a crucial, unconscious effort to maintain mental equilibrium in an environment designed to shatter it. The brief, vivid warmth of a dream could offer a psychological reset, a fleeting moment of peace before the harsh reality of another freezing, arduous day at sea recommenced. This mental fortitude, bolstered by unconscious escapes, was as vital to their survival as their layered woolens and salted provisions. The biting cold, the nauseating lurch, and the pervasive reek were all amplified by an insidious enemy that permeated every fibre of medieval shipboard life. Ceaseless dampness. This wasn't merely the occasional splash of seawater. It was a bone-deep, omnipresent wetness that seeped into everything, creating a perpetually clammy environment, even below decks. For the pirates attempting to sleep during brutal winter voyages, this constant damp became a relentless antagonist to rest and well-being. The construction of early medieval longships, while remarkably advanced for their era, offered limited defense against moisture. Clinker-built hulls, sealed with tarred moss or animal hair, were effective at keeping the sea out in general, but condensation within the cramped, unventilated internal spaces was unavoidable. As historian and maritime archaeologist Dr. Ann Peterson points out, the internal environment of these ships would have been perpetually humid. Add to this the spray over the bows, rain, melted snow, and the inevitable ingress of bilge water, and every surface, from the ship's timbers to the sleeping robes, would become saturated. Imagine lying down wrapped in what feels like a perpetually chilled, slightly sodden blanket, your breath condensing visibly in the cold, still air around you. This constant dampness had several critical implications for sleep. Wet clothing loses its insulating properties drastically. Even the finest wool becomes less effective when saturated, drawing heat away from the body at an accelerated rate. This increased the risk of hypothermia and made comfortable sleep virtually impossible. Furthermore, prolonged exposure to damp conditions contributes to a host of ailments, from exacerbated joint pain and respiratory infections to skin conditions and trench foot. Medical issues that would have made achieving any significant period of undisturbed rest an extraordinary feat. The struggle against damp was not a battle won, but merely endured, a testament to the sheer physical hardship of winter pirating. In the face of relentless cold and pervasive damp, one of the most fundamental involuntary survival strategies for medieval pirates attempting to sleep was the sharing of body heat. This practice, far from being a social nicety, was a stark necessity, a physiological imperative born from the unforgiving environment of a winter sea voyage. Huddled together in cramped below-deck spaces, the crew members pooled their warmth, turning communal proximity into a vital defense against hypothermia. biological studies of thermoregulation confirm the efficacy of this method. Multiple human bodies in close contact significantly reduce the rate of heat loss compared to individuals sleeping in isolation. Each body acts as a small living furnace, radiating warmth that can be trapped and shared by the adjacent bodies and insulating layers. Anthropologist Dr. Neil Price highlights how communal sleeping was a common practice across many pre-modern cultures, especially in challenging climates, underscoring its evolutionary effectiveness. For a ship's crew, with ambient internal temperatures often hovering just above freezing, this collective warmth could mean the difference between severe hypothermia and merely unpleasant cold. Imagine a group of a dozen or more men, bundled in their damp wool and furs, packed like sardines onto the wooden floor or makeshift platforms of a longship's interior. Every curve of a back, every outstretched arm, every shared blanket became part of a larger, living insulation system. While the close quarters undoubtedly exacerbated issues of hygiene and personal space, the survival benefits in an era before effective heating technology were undeniable. This forced intimacy, born of desperation rather than affection, transformed the act of sleeping into a coordinated, if unconscious, act of collective survival, a testament to the primal human drive to endure even the most brutal conditions. The assault on a medieval pirate's senses during a winter voyage extended beyond the physical discomforts of cold, damp, and poor hygiene. The soundscape itself was a relentless, often terrifying symphony. For those attempting to snatch minutes of sleep below deck, the dominant soundtrack was a ceaseless cacophony, the rhythmic groans and creaks of the wooden hull under stress, intertwined with the chilling, mournful howl of the wind tearing across the open sea. These ships, magnificent as they were essentially complex wooden machines constantly flexing and struggling against immense natural forces. The clinker-built construction, where planks overlapped, meant that each joint and timber would continually rub and shift against its neighbor. Dr. Kevin Green, an expert in archaeological acoustics, notes that the sounds emanating from a longship's hull in rough seas would have been far from harmonious. Every groan, crack, and shudder would have been amplified within the confined space below deck, a constant reminder of the thin wooden barrier between the crew and the raging abyss outside. These were not the gentle creaks of a house in the wind, but the sounds of wood being pushed to its structural limits. Concurrently, the unbridled force of the winter gales would create a high-pitched, penetrating howl as it ripped through the rigging and across the exposed decks. This sound varied from a low guttural roar during severe storms to a cutting whistle, each iteration a stark indicator of the weather's ferocity. The combined effect of these sounds would have made auditory rest a near impossibility. Even for those accustomed to a life at sea, the underlying tension induced by the hull's protestations and the wind's shriek would have kept the nervous system primed for danger. Deep, restorative sleep, which relies on a degree of peace and stillness, would have been continually fractured by this relentless, anxiety-inducing auditory environment, further contributing to the chronic sleep deprivation endemic to winter pirating. In the long, dark, and often interminable hours between tasks, particularly during the reduced daylight of winter, medieval pirates found ways to occupy their minds and hands. With opportunities for genuine rest severely limited, activities like rudimentary carving, or scrimshaw in later nautical terminology, offered a meditative focus and a means to momentarily escape the overwhelming misery of their environment. While the term scrimshaw typically refers to the later practice of whalers, the core concept, modifying natural materials into small personal artifacts, was undoubtedly present in earlier maritime cultures. Archaeological digs of Viking Age sites and ship finds have yielded numerous examples of small, carved objects made from wood, bone, and antler. These include decorative pins, combs, game pieces, like chess or nefertafel, and even small figurative carvings. These items, often remarkably intricate given the tools available, suggest that creative output was a valuable way to pass the time and engage fine motor skills during periods of enforced idleness. While we lack direct documentation of pirates specifically engaging in such activities at sea, the universality of human need for occupation suggests it was prevalent. Dr. Elsa Rosdahl, a prominent scholar of the Viking Age, notes the widespread evidence of craftsmanship, even in modest settings, indicating that such skills were common. This tactile engagement offered more than just distraction. The concentration required for detailed carving could induce a trance-like state, a mental reprieve from the cold, the noise, and the damp. It provided a sense of purpose and productivity in an otherwise bleak existence, perhaps allowing for a different kind of sleep, a waking meditation that quieted the anxieties of the sea. These small personalized objects were not just time fillers. They represented a connection to human artistry and a means to preserve a sense of self and purpose amidst the dehumanizing conditions of a winter pirate ship. Perhaps, through the repetition of pattern and the shaping of material, one could carve away the edges of the longest, coldest nights, finding a form of mental solace when physical sleep was impossible. The quest for warmth and comfort during winter at sea extended even to the very provisions that sustained life. While food offered crucial calories for maintaining body temperature and energy, the dietary realities for medieval pirates were far from palatable, often contributing another layer of discomfort to their already brutal existence. The diet was overwhelmingly dominated by the taste of salt and smoke, the hallmarks of preservation methods vital for long voyages. Evidence from bog bodies and cesspits from the early medieval period, alongside historical texts like the Icelandic sagas, paint a clear picture of a diet rich in protein and fats, but lacking in fresh produce. The staples for any extended sea journey were dried fish, such as cod or herring, and various forms of salted and smoked meats, typically beef, pork, or game if available. These preserved foods offered excellent shelf stability and high caloric density, essential for physical exertion and combating the cold. However, they came with significant drawbacks. Imagine trying to eat hardtack and dried, salty meat with hands stiff from cold, or trying to chew a piece of leathery, salt-preserved fish without access to fresh water for rehydration. The constant intake of highly salted foods would have induced persistent thirst, a condition exacerbated by the limited supply of fresh water and the consumption of weak ale or mead, which were often more reliable than untreated water, but still dehydrating in effect. Nutrition historian Dr. Roberta Gilchrist notes that while the caloric content was often sufficient, the lack of variety, fresh vitamins and minerals would lead to chronic health issues over prolonged periods, impacting overall well-being and, consequently, sleep quality. Digestion would also be a challenging process, potentially leading to discomfort. The monotonous, salty, and smoky diet was therefore a purely functional one, a comfortless sustenance designed for survival, not enjoyment, and one that added to the body's internal stresses even as it provided vital energy. Ultimately, For the medieval pirate enduring a winter at sea, the greatest obstacle to restful sleep was the profound existential awareness of their vulnerability. Stripped bare of the comforts and perceived safety of land, they were locked in an uncompromising embrace with the ocean, where the illusion of sanctuary, even within the hull of their ship, was often brutally shattered. This constant, underlying psychological stress profoundly impacted their ability to achieve deep, regenerative sleep. The statistics of medieval seafaring are stark. Even outside of direct combat, shipwrecks were common, largely due to storms, navigation errors, and the inherent limitations of vessel construction. Records from portholes and chroniclers, although incomplete for pirate activities, indicate a significant attrition rate for vessels attempting winter voyages in northern waters. For example, evidence from early medieval chronicles, such as the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, frequently mentions severe storms and the loss of ships. This ambient danger was not abstract. It was an ever-present spectre, amplified by the harshness of winter conditions, where survival in the water for more than minutes often meant certain death from hypothermia. Even below deck, the creaking timbers and the raging tempest were visceral reminders of their precarious position. Sleep, in such an environment, often became a form of psychological escapism rather than true restoration. Neuroscientific research confirms that chronic stress and anxiety severely disrupt sleep architecture, reducing time spent in deep REM and slow-wave sleep cycles vital for physical and mental recovery. For these pirates, even when their bodies were exhausted, their minds remained on high alert, a primal survival mechanism preventing true unconsciousness. The brief, fitful periods of rest snatched between watches or during lulls in the tempest would have been characterized by heightened apprehension. The true peace of sleep was a luxury afforded only when safely harbored on land, far from the terrifying reality of being just a wooden shell away from the crushing embrace of the frozen winter ocean. Their sleep was a constant battle, a testament to the indomitable human spirit striving for survival against overwhelming odds. The physical tolls of winter pirating extended far beyond the generalized cold and damp. They manifested directly on the bodies of the crew, particularly their extremities. Imagine, for a moment, attempting to manipulate frozen ropes, handle ice-slick tools, or even perform basic tasks with hands that are either blistered from constant friction or so profoundly frost-numbed they lack all sensation. This was the brutal reality that contributed to chronic discomfort and, ultimately, to fractured sleep patterns for pirates. The combination of extreme cold, constant wetness, and physically demanding labor created a perfect storm for debilitating injuries to the hands and feet. Frostbite, a direct injury to body tissues caused by freezing, was a constant threat. While severe cases could lead to amputation, even milder forms, frostnip or superficial frostbite, cause intense pain, blistering, and numbness that could persist for hours or days. The archaeological record, particularly from skeletal remains found in northern regions, often reveals evidence of chronic bone and joint degeneration in extremities, consistent with prolonged exposure to cold and damp. Dr. Christina Kilgrove, a bioarchaeologist focusing on skeletal pathology, frequently discusses the commonality of such hand and foot ailments in seafaring populations. Furthermore, the ceaseless work of maintaining a vessel in rough winter seas, raising and lowering sails, rowing for extended periods, bailing water, and maneuvering the steering oar, would have caused severe chafing and blistering. Gloves, while sometimes worn, were often made of leather that quickly became stiff when wet and frozen, or inadequate wool that offered little protection from friction. These injuries were not mere inconveniences. They were chronic sources of pain that would make finding a comfortable sleeping position difficult, if not impossible. Each new position would likely bring a fresh wave of stinging, aching discomfort, further disrupting any attempt at restorative sleep. The physical suffering etched onto their hands was a daily testament to their survival and a nightly torment. While many huddled below deck in a desperate search for warmth and fleeting sleep, a critical few stood vigil, subjected to the full, unbridled fury of the winter elements. The watchman's duties extended far beyond mere lookout. They were the ship's eyes and ears against a hostile cosmos, their sleepless hours directly impacting the safety and survival of the entire crew. For these individuals, the concept of sleep was a distant dream. The watch schedule on a Viking-age longship, while not explicitly documented with modern detail, would have been essential for navigation, vigilance against other vessels or hazards, and monitoring weather changes. Given the limited crew sizes, typically 30 to 60 men, and the multifunctional nature of each sailor, watches would have been grueling, likely lasting several hours before rotation. Exposure to the elements was absolute. Imagine standing on the open deck of a longship for 3 or 4 hours in the middle of a North Sea winter night. The ambient air temperature often below freezing, waves crashing over the bow, wind cutting through bone. Historical accounts from the Heimskringla sagas, describing the voyages of Norse kings, periodically allude to the incredible hardships endured by crews on watch, emphasizing their resilience against the cold and storm. Despite the profound physical discomfort, the watchman's vigil also offered a unique, if chilling, perspective. Under wide, star-dusted skies in periods between storms, far from the light pollution of land, the cosmos would have been awe-inspiringly visible. The aurora borealis, more frequently seen in higher latitudes, would have painted the heavens with ethereal light, a phenomenon that ancient Norse cultures often interpreted as manifestations of spiritual power. Yet even this celestial grandeur would be viewed through eyes stinging from salt and wind, by a body shivering from cold. These moments, while perhaps offering a fleeting sense of wonder, serve primarily as a stark reminder of the ship's minuscule place in a vast, indifferent universe, further deepening the psychological isolation and the physical toll exacted by their sleepless duties. For those moments when a medieval pirate might finally drift towards sleep, the auditory landscape remained a constant intrusion, punctuated even by the very elements of the ship's construction. Beyond the groans of the hull and the howl of the wind, the creaking of ropes, taut and protesting against the ceaseless motion, would have formed a deeply unsettling, yet ever-present, lullaby. This was not a comforting sound, but rather an insistent reminder of constant strain and the imminent danger of equipment failure. The rigging of a longship, constructed primarily from animal sinews, leather, or twisted vegetable fibers such as hemp, was under immense tension, especially in rough seas. These ropes, constantly subjected to salt water, freezing temperatures and chafing, would stiffen and contract, creating a symphony of sharp, high-pitched creaks and groans as the ship pitched and rolled. Modern experimental archaeology, such as the reconstruction and sailing of the Havingston fra Glendalough, sea stallion from Glendalough, a full-scale replica of the Skulderlev II longship, has allowed researchers to experience firsthand the intense auditory environment produced by such rigging. Project observations have consistently documented the constant noise generated by ropes and blocks under load, especially when wet and cold. Each creak and snap would register on a subconscious level, signaling potential issues. A sudden change in rhythm, a particularly sharp crack, could indicate a rope nearing its breaking point or a mast stressed to its limit. For the sleeping pirate, this was not background noise that faded into unconsciousness. It was a vigilance alarm, a constant subtle trigger that prevented deep, restorative sleep. The human brain, even in sleep, monitors its environment for threats. The creaking ropes would have exploited this primal mechanism, keeping the crew in a state of heightened, if subconscious, alert. This constant auditory reminder of imminent danger significantly contributed to the chronic sleep deprivation, underscoring how every aspect of the winter voyage conspired against the possibility of true rest. As if the cold, damp stench and incessant noise weren't enough, the medieval pirate attempting to sleep during winter faced yet another pervasive foe: widespread illness. Life on board a crowded, unhygienic ship during the colder months became a breeding ground for infections and diseases that not only debilitated crews, but made any semblance of restorative rest nearly impossible. For many, sickness became an added, profound torment. Historical evidence from later maritime periods consistently details the devastating impact of illness on ship crews, from scurvy to typhus and dysentery. While direct medical records for early medieval pirate voyages are scarce, the conditions provide a clear blueprint for disease propagation. Scurvy, caused by a severe lack of vitamin C, would have been prevalent on long voyages where fresh produce was non-existent. Its symptoms, extreme fatigue, joint pain, gum disease, and slow healing wounds, would have greatly curtailed physical activity and made comfortable sleep agonizing. Furthermore, the close confines, poor ventilation, and lack of personal hygiene fostered the rapid spread of respiratory infections, like influenza or pneumonia, especially when combined with compromised immune systems due to cold and malnutrition. Dr. Carol Rawcliffe, a historian of medieval medicine, emphasizes that infectious diseases were a constant threat to any densely populated group, particularly in unhygienic conditions. The very acts of communal living and shared body heat, while crucial for warmth, also ensured efficient disease transmission. A single sick individual could, and often would, infect a significant portion of the crew. Imagine trying to sleep when racked with a fever, or dealing with the constant coughing and general malaise of a respiratory infection, all while still being jostled by the ship's motion and surrounded by the sights, sounds, and smells of your suffering shipmates. The chronic pain from injuries, coupled with the systemic effects of various illnesses, transformed the already precarious act of sleeping into an utter misery. Disease didn't just cause suffering, it robbed the body of its most basic need, the ability to regenerate and recover through undisturbed sleep. Beneath the superficial layers of physical hardship and sensory assault, a deeper, more primal fear gnawed at the medieval pirate's psyche during winter voyages: the terrifying prospect of freezing to death. This was not a hypothetical risk, but a palpable, ever-present danger, a fear that profoundly shaped their sleeping patterns, or lack thereof. The cold was a predator, and venturing into unconsciousness was to potentially surrender to its deadly embrace. Human physiology dictates that core body temperature must be maintained within a very narrow range, around 37 degrees C or 98.6 degrees, for survival. Prolonged exposure to temperatures even slightly below this, especially when wet and exhausted, leads rapidly to hypothermia. As core temperature drops, cognitive functions decline, judgment becomes impaired, and drowsiness sets in, a treacherous precursor to death. For medieval seafarers, the warning signs of hypothermia, uncontrollable shivering, confusion, slurred speech, would have been familiar if terrifying observations among their crewmates. The knowledge that falling into a deep sleep could be the final descent into unconsciousness from which one might never awaken was a chilling reality. Dr. Wayne Dyer, a specialist in cold weather survival, emphasizes that the body's natural defense mechanisms often work against survival in extreme cold, leading to a full sense of warmth before the final collapse. This internalized existential fear would have made truly relaxing into sleep incredibly difficult. Even when succumbing to exhaustion, the mind would likely remain on an anxious alert, subconsciously battling the encroaching cold. The drive to stay awake, to maintain vigilance over one's own body temperature, would have been a constant, exhausting struggle. Shared body heat, layered clothing, and caloric intake were all direct responses to this fear, but they rarely eliminated it entirely. Thus, the pirates' sleep was often nothing more than a shallow, defensive stupor, a brief surcease from conscious suffering, continually interrupted by the primal, terrifying instinct to survive the night against the silent, deadly threat of the cold. In their desperate struggle against the biting cold and overwhelming exhaustion, medieval pirates, like sailors across many epochs, often turned to alcoholic beverages for perceived warmth and a fleeting sense of comfort. While the distilled spirit we know as rum originated later, strong beers, mead, and potent fermented ciders would have served a similar purpose. This warmth of rum, though a brief and deceptive solace, played a significant role in their attempts to cope with the brutal winter environment, directly influencing their ability to sleep. The immediate sensation of warmth that alcohol provides is a physiological deception. Alcohol causes vasodilation, increasing blood flow to the skin and producing a flushed, warm feeling. However, this increased surface blood flow accelerates heat loss from the core, making the individual more susceptible to hypothermia. While a small amount of alcohol might relax muscles and hasten the onset of sleep, its overall effect on sleep quality is detrimental. Clinical studies show that alcohol disrupts the later, more restorative stages of sleep, leading to fragmented rest and reduced REM cycles. Dr. Matthew Walker, a leading neuroscientist specializing in sleep, consistently highlights how alcohol fragments sleep, leading to reduced cognitive function and recovery despite inducing initial drowsiness. For pirate crews, therefore, the warmth offered by these strong beverages was a dangerous illusion. It might have offered a few brief hours of unconsciousness, but it would have been poor quality sleep, leaving them less rested and more vulnerable to the cold and the rigors of the next day. Furthermore, the dehydrating effects of alcohol, combined with the already highly salted diet and limited fresh water, would have exacerbated discomfort. In the context of the confined, unhygienic conditions, impaired judgment from alcohol could also lead to altercations or accidents, further compounding the dangers. The warmth of rum thus represents a poignant paradox, a sought-after comfort that in reality undermined the very survival it was invoked to aid, transforming sleep into an even more elusive and less beneficial experience. As the medieval pirates sought to rest, the faint, flickering light of oil lamps or rudimentary braziers below deck would cast dancing shadows upon the condensation-slicked wooden walls, morphing the cramped confines into a scene both eerie and profoundly unsettling. These visual distortions, combined with the constant motion and the crew's heightened state of alert, contributed another layer of psychological impact to their already fractured attempts at sleep, blurring the lines between reality and nightmare. The lighting on board these early vessels was, by modern standards, incredibly dim and unstable. Fat lamps, often simple wick oil devices, provided minimal illumination, barely enough to navigate the immediate surroundings. Braziers, when used, offered more light but presented a dangerous fire hazard on wooden ships already laden with flammable materials. These weak, wavering light sources would throw distorted, elongated shadows that played tricks on the eyes. Imagine a sleeping pirate, roused by the ship's lurch or a sudden noise, opening his eyes to see grotesque figures seeming to writhe and contort on the damp timbers around him. Psychologists specializing in sensory deprivation and extreme environments note that visual ambiguity, especially in low-light conditions, can readily trigger primal fear responses and contribute to disorientation. The lack of consistent, clear light, coupled with the constant noise and the ever-present threat of the sea, would have made it difficult for the brain to transition effectively into deeper sleep stages. The brain processes visual information even in semi-conscious states, and these dancing shadows would have continuously fed it unsettling stimuli. Furthermore, in the close proximity of so many sleeping bodies, the shadows of restless individuals or swaying cargo could easily be misinterpreted. This constant subconscious processing of uncertain visual input would contribute to fragmented sleep, a pervasive sense of unease, and potentially vivid, stress-induced nightmares. The shadows on those icy walls were not merely visual phenomena. They were active participants in the psychological torment of a winter night at sea, preventing true mental respite. Amidst the overwhelming misery of a medieval winter voyage, where every condition conspired against comfort and rest, there remained one profoundly human element that offered a fragile yet essential buffer against the elements: the comfort of companionship. While the physical crowding of shared sleep was a pragmatic survival tactic, the psychological benefit of being surrounded by fellow humans, especially in extremis, cannot be overstated. This precarious sense of community offered a vital, albeit limited, solace against profound isolation and existential dread. Longships were inherently communal environments, with crews ranging from 30 to 60 or more, and limited space. Private moments were virtually non-existent. This enforced proximity, while contributing to hygiene issues and tension, also fostered strong bonds of camaraderie and mutual dependency. Anthropological studies on small group dynamics in high-stress environments consistently demonstrate the critical role of social cohesion for morale and survival. Even in the silence of attempted sleep, the rhythmic breathing of another human body nearby could be a reassuring presence. Dr. Patricia Rubertone, an expert in early human social structures, highlights the deeply ingrained human need for belonging, especially when facing shared adversity. The sagas, though often focused on heroic deeds, occasionally depict scenes of men sharing stories, singing, or playing board games during lulls in activity, particularly during long watches or when harbored. These activities, though not directly related to sleep, built the social foundation that made collective rest, even a miserable one, tolerable, knowing that others shared the same suffering, that their lives literally depended on each other's endurance, forged a powerful, if unspoken, connection. This psychological comfort, the awareness of not being alone against the terrifying might of the winter ocean, helped to mitigate some of the pervasive anxieties that would otherwise shatter any hope of rest. The shared struggle, the silent acknowledgement of collective hardship, thus became a fragile bond, offering a small human warmth in the face of an immensely hostile world. For the medieval pirate forced to find refuge during the worst of winter, particularly when unable to remain at full sea, anchoring in a sheltered fjord or river presented its own insidious challenges. The seemingly calm stability offered by land proximity often camouflaged a new, equally perilous threat: the crunch of ice underfoot. This treacherous stability introduced novel risks that further fragmented any opportunity for true rest, demanding constant vigilance even when safe. As temperatures plummeted below freezing for extended periods, a common occurrence in Scandinavian and North Atlantic winters, the very water surrounding the anchored ship would begin to harden. Ice formations, from thin sheets to substantial floes, or even pack ice, could quickly develop. Imagine stepping onto what appears to be stable decking, only for it to be covered in a thin, treacherous layer of rime ice, making every movement a potential fall. The danger extended beyond slipping. If a ship became trapped in expanding ice, the immense pressure could crush wooden hulls, as documented by cases of ships lost to ice in later historical periods. But the principles of ice expansion would have been fatal even for robust longships. Maritime archaeologists like Dr. Ole Crumlin Pedersen have studied the vulnerability of early wooden ships to ice pressures, noting their relative fragility compared to monolithic ice formations. Even when not actively crushing a vessel, ice presented practical problems. Walking across an ice-covered deck to perform watch duties or access stores became a perilous venture. The rhythmic crunching sound, instead of being reassuring, announced constant movement and potential danger. Furthermore, in areas prone to tidal shifts, anchored ships could run aground on ice floes at low tide or be lifted and dropped, stressing anchor lines and hulls. This perceived stability of being anchored was a deceptive one. The need for constant monitoring against shifting ice, potential damage, and the ever-present danger of becoming trapped meant that crews, even when not actively sailing, remained in a heightened state of watchfulness. The crunch of ice underfoot was a constant, auditory reminder that even in relative shelter, sleep remained a luxury perpetually deferred. Through all the grinding hardships, the cold, the damp, the stench, the constant peril, what sustained the medieval pirate through the brutal winter months was not a tangible comfort, but an intangible force. The distant, desperate hope of spring. This promise of warmer weather, longer days, and the thaw of the sea ice was a psychological lifeline, a fragile light at the end of an interminably long tunnel. It was a hope that helped them endure the sleepless nights and the draining days. The cyclical nature of the seasons was deeply embedded in medieval life and a fundamental aspect of Norse cosmology. Spring, or Vardarai, represented renewal, growth, and the resumption of activity. For sea raiders, it signified the reopening of prime sailing routes, opportunities for plunder and trade, and a respite from the immediate, life-threatening conditions of winter voyages. Records from early medieval trading centres like Kaupang and Birka show a marked increase in maritime activity during spring and summer, directly correlating with improved weather and sea conditions. Historian Dr. Judith Jesch highlights how seasonal changes dictated nearly every aspect of life in the Viking Age, making spring's arrival an event of immense practical and psychological significance. This collective anticipation, this shared vision of forthcoming relief, likely played a crucial role in maintaining morale and preventing total despair. Even when curled against a shipmate, shivering and half-starved, the thought of the sun on one's face, the feeling of dry clothes, and the promise of land-based comforts, perhaps even truly restorative sleep in a warm bed, offered a reason to endure. This mental resilience, fueled by a collective longing for the seasonal shift, allowed them to push through the exhaustion and maintain the vigilance necessary for survival. The promise of spring was more than just a calendar date. It was a potent psychological anchor, a silent shared prayer that helped them navigate the darkest, coldest reaches of the medieval winter and the profound sleep deprivation it enforced. In the face of unremitting cold, the human body and mind, remarkably resilient, adapt through a process of desensitization. For medieval pirates during winter voyages, this was less a choice and more a grim, involuntary physiological and psychological adaptation to their extreme environment. The constant exposure to low temperatures, while never truly comfortable, eventually altered their perception of cold, a coping mechanism crucial for survival and for snatching any degree of rest. Physiologically, prolonged cold exposure can lead to what is known as cold habituation. This involves a reduction in shivering responses and a shift in metabolic rate, allowing the body to tolerate lower temperatures without triggering the full alarm response. While this doesn't mean they were no longer cold, it allowed them to function, and perhaps even sleep, in conditions that would incapacitate an unadapted individual. Research into indigenous populations living in cold climates, such as the Inuit or Sami, demonstrates how intergenerational exposure leads to these kinds of physiological adaptations. While medieval pirates wouldn't possess the same genetic adaptations, constant immersion in the cold would induce similar changes over a single season. Anthropologist Dr. John F. Kelly, specializing in human adaptation to climate, points out that such desensitization is a learned response, allowing individuals to conserve energy by preventing excessive shivering. Psychologically, this adaptation manifests as a dulling of the perception of cold. What would be agonizing initially becomes merely uncomfortable, then eventually a new baseline. This mental hardening, though never eliminating the danger, allowed them to override the constant distress signals the body sent. It enabled them to lie still, to endure the damp, to share body heat without constant complaint, and perhaps, crucially, to fall into a shallow, fitful sleep, even when conditions were appalling. This desensitization was not a luxury. It was a fundamental component of their resilience, a grim testament to the body's capacity to adjust to the most hostile environments. It allowed them to find a form of sleep, not because they were warm, but because their bodies had learned to mute the screaming urgency of the cold. In the dark, frigid confines below deck, when the elements outside raged and physical comfort was a distant memory, medieval pirates found another profound source of warmth, the hearth of shared memory, sparked by the telling of stories. These oral traditions, vibrant and deeply ingrained in Norse culture, offered a potent psychological escape, a communal act of defiance against the harsh realities that denied them restful sleep. The sagas and Eddic poems, originally oral traditions before being committed to vellum, are rich with tales of legendary heroes, gods, epic battles, and daring voyages. These narratives were the primary form of entertainment and cultural transmission, especially during long winter nights. While the notion of a ship's captain recounting sagas by a roaring fire might be romanticized, the reality on a cramped, cold longship would have been different. Imagine a voice, perhaps hoarse from the cold and sea spray, weaving tales in the gloom below deck, the story itself a comfort. Dr. Caroline Larrington, a scholar of Old Norse literature, emphasizes the communal aspect of saga telling and its didactic and entertaining functions. These stories did more than fill the silence. They reaffirmed identity, shared values, and offered a mental journey away from the ship. For pirates struggling to cope with sleep deprivation and the constant threat of death, these stories provided a vital psychological release. They could transport the listeners, even just for a few precious moments, to warmer, safer places, into worlds of valor and glory, or simply away from the stench and the damp. They offered a shared mental space, a collective focus that could, perhaps, induce a form of mental sleep, a respite for the beleaguered mind. This act of communal storytelling was a testament to the enduring power of human imagination and social connection. It provided an emotional warmth that no physical fire could match, allowing these hardened mariners a brief, vital reprieve, proving that even in the most brutal conditions, the human spirit could seek and find a form of solace and escape. As the endless winter night finally surrendered, the medieval pirates' world was not greeted by a vibrant sunrise, but by the starkness of dawn. It was a pale, grey world, a reluctant reawakening that brought with it not the promise of rest, but the grim necessity of facing another day of relentless struggle against the elements and the weariness of chronic sleep deprivation. This was the cold, hard reality that greeted them after their fitful, fragmented attempts at sleep. The length of daylight during winter in the North Sea region is dramatically curtailed. In latitudes above 60° gnawing, for instance, daylight can be as short as 5 to 6 hours if the sun rises above the horizon at all. This meant that the majority of the day was spent in a twilight gloom, further reinforcing the psychological burden of the season. Emerging from the cramped semi-darkness below deck, the pirates would be met with a monochromatic palette of grey skies, tumultuous grey seas, and a world still clenched in winter's icy grip. Historical accounts, such as the Landnámabók, Book of Settlements, while detailing the settlement of Iceland, implicitly highlight the grueling nature of winter survival, where daylight hours offered little warmth or reprieve. The immediate consequences for the crew were profound. Their bodies, stiffened by cold and damp, would ache anew with every movement. Minds, dulled by insufficient sleep, would struggle for clear thought and sharp reaction. The very act of beginning the day's tasks, setting sails, hauling ropes, bailing water, would be an exercise in sheer brute force and ingrained discipline, requiring supreme effort from already exhausted individuals. The lack of morning light, which plays a critical role in regulating circadian rhythms and promoting wakefulness, further perpetuated the cycle of fatigue. This harsh reawakening was a daily reminder that sleep, true restorative sleep, remained a distant luxury, a promise broken by the dawn. Each grey morning demanded a renewed commitment to endure, a testament to the sheer physical and mental fortitude required to survive another day at sea during the brutal medieval winter. Among the myriad physical hardships endured by medieval pirates, the state of their personal gear, particularly their footwear, presented a constant, insidious torment that profoundly affected their ability to find any measure of comfort or rest. Imagine boots, heavy leather perhaps lined with felt or fur, that were perpetually wet, cold, and often stiff with ice and salt. These were not merely uncomfortable. They were a significant burden that, even in moments of attempted sleep, would have been ever present. The footwear of the early medieval period varied, but for seafarers, sturdy leather boots were essential for protection against the elements and the rough surfaces of a wooden ship. However, these boots were largely unwaterproofed by modern standards. Constant exposure to sea spray, rain, and the unavoidable dampness below deck meant they would rarely, if ever, be truly dry. Once saturated, leather loses its insulating properties and becomes heavy, cold, and rigid. Archaeological finds from urban and port excavations, such as those in Dublin and York, reveal numerous examples of early medieval leather boots, often heavily worn and patched, illustrating their continuous use and the challenges of their maintenance. Dr. Cordelia Hall, an expert in historical costume and textiles, highlights the practical difficulties of drying such substantial leather items in an environment bereft of consistent heat. The physiological consequences of constantly wearing saturated, cold footwear were severe. Beyond the obvious discomfort, the perpetual dampness led directly to painful conditions like trench foot, also known as immersion foot, characterized by numbness, redness, swelling, and ulceration. This debilitating condition, if severe enough, could lead to gangrene and amputation. Even milder forms would cause incessant aching and tenderness, making it excruciatingly difficult to find a comfortable position to rest the feet, let alone the whole body. The burden of heavy, wet boots was thus more than just a nuisance. It was a source of chronic pain and a direct impediment to sleep. Stripping them off might offer temporary relief, but the prospect of forcing cold, stiff boots onto swollen, tender feet in the morning made leaving them on a grim yet understandable choice. This constant physical suffering, centered around one of the body's most basic means of interaction with the world, was an omnipresent reminder of the harsh, comfortless existence of these medieval mariners. Beyond the immediate physical and psychological torments, the daily sustenance that fueled these mariners added another layer of pervasive discomfort, directly affecting their overall well-being and ability to achieve restful sleep. The ubiquitous ship's biscuit, or hardtack, a staple of long sea voyages for centuries, transformed into a particularly unappetizing and challenging source of calories in the medieval winter. Imagine the taste of stale, often insect-ridden, and then frozen hardtack, gnawed at in the biting cold. Hardtack, essentially a simple unleavened bread made from flour and water, baked until rock hard to prevent spoilage, was an ideal non-perishable food for extended periods without fresh provisions. While providing necessary carbohydrates, its palatability was notoriously low. In winter conditions, this problem was compounded. Below decks, the lack of consistent heat meant that even these basic provisions could freeze solid. Consuming frozen, rock-hard biscuits would have been a painful and difficult endeavor, demanding considerable muscular effort from already tired jaws. The noise alone of a crew attempting to break and chew such rations in the semi-darkness would have been another cacophony to disrupt any quiet moments. Food historian Dr. Ken Albala states that sailors throughout history routinely complained about the quality and texture of their biscuits, often soaking them in brine or stew to soften them, a luxury not always available on a winter longship. Furthermore, these simple biscuits provided insufficient nutrients, especially when combined with a diet of heavily salted meats and dried fish. The absence of fresh vegetables and fruits inevitably led to vitamin deficiencies, as previously discussed regarding scurvy. The gastrointestinal distress resulting from such a monotonous and fibrous diet, often coupled with poor hydration, would have been a significant contributor to discomfort. Imagine trying to sleep with a stomach battling indigestible food, constantly feeling hungry yet repulsed by the next meal. This pervasive dietary misery, an inescapable part of the winter voyage, actively worked against the possibility of restful sleep, embodying the constant grinding hardship that defined this brutal existence. For the medieval pirate, genuine silence was not merely rare, it was functionally non-existent during a winter sea voyage. In an age devoid of mechanized sound, offshore was supposed to be a place of quiet, dominated only by natural rhythms. Yet, in the North Sea during winter, the elements orchestrated a perpetual deafening roar, an unceasing auditory assault that fundamentally undermined any chance of achieving truly restorative sleep. The primary culprits were the wind and waves. Winter storms in the North Atlantic generated sustained winds far exceeding Beaufort Force 8, resulting in towering waves, often over 5 meters, 16 feet high. These conditions created a constant barrage of sound. The shrill shriek of the wind tearing through rigging, the thunderous crash of waves against the clinker-built hull, the sustained roar of the ocean as the ship carved its path through the tempest. Below deck, these sounds would be muffled but ever present, joined by the creaks and groans of the stressed timbers themselves, a symphony of structural protest. Oceanographer Dr. Helen Chersky highlights the immense energy of a winter storm, an energy relentlessly converted into acoustic vibrations that permeate every part of a vessel. The human brain requires periods of relative quiet to properly cycle through the stages of sleep, particularly for the deeper, more restorative phases. Constant exposure to high decibel levels, even if the sounds become ambient, prevents the brain from fully shutting down its auditory processing. This continuous auditory stimulation keeps the nervous system in a state of heightened arousal, making it difficult to fall asleep, stay asleep, and achieve quality sleep. The concept of white noise for sleep, so common today, relies on a constant and non-threatening sound. The sounds of a winter storm were anything but non-threatening. They were direct indicators of immediate peril. Thus, the absence of silence was more than just a nuisance. It was a profound environmental stressor that conspired with every other hardship to ensure that the medieval pirate's sleep was at best a fractured, weary negotiation with an unyielding and roaring world. Adding to the symphony of discomforts aboard a medieval pirate ship was a pervasive acrid smell that permeated every fibre of its construction. The scent of tar, pitch, and the residues of desperate, ongoing repairs. While these substances were vital for the vessel's integrity, their odour, especially when confined below deck, created another persistent assault on the senses, interfering with any hope of restful sleep. Tar and pitch, derived from pine resin, were fundamental to the shipbuilding of the era. Tar was used to waterproof ropes and sails, prolonging their life and increasing their resilience against the elements. Pitch, a thicker, more viscous form, was used to caulk the seams of the clinker-built hulls, making them watertight. Archaeological discoveries of shipyards and ships, such as the Viking Ship Museum in Roskilde, showcase the extensive use of these materials. The preparation and application of these substances would have saturated the ship with their distinctive pungent aroma. In the cold, damp conditions below deck, with minimal ventilation, these odours would linger heavily. Dr. Helen Nicholson, an expert in medieval technologies, notes that the smell of tar would have been an unavoidable and constant companion for anyone on an early medieval ship. Moreover, winter voyages, particularly in tumultuous North Sea conditions, often necessitated ongoing repairs. Constant stress from waves and ice could cause seams to open or timbers to shift, leading to leaks. These desperate measures often involved recaulking with freshly heated pitch or tar, intensifying the fumes within the confined spaces. Imagine trying to sleep amid the sweet yet suffocating smell of fresh tar fumes, which, if inhaled in sufficient quantities, could cause irritation to the respiratory system, headaches, and even nausea. These chemical olfactory assaults, combined with the earlier discussed biological odors, created an air quality inimical to sleep. The body, struggling to breathe and deal with the irritating fumes, would remain in a state of subtle distress, further fragmenting any chance of deep, restorative rest. The smell of tar and pitch was the smell of survival, but it was far from the smell of comfort. Amidst the cacophony of the storm, the creaking of timber, and the constant discomfort, there existed a profound, almost palpable, shared silence among the crew attempting to sleep, the silence of suffering. This was not an absence of sound, but a consensual, unspoken agreement born of mutual understanding and exhaustion, a language without words that acknowledged the collective misery and the desperate need for any semblance of rest. In the confined, cold, and damp spaces below deck, open complaining would have been counterproductive, quickly eroding morale. Instead, a more subtle, non-verbal communication would have prevailed. The rustle of a body shifting, a deep sigh, a suppressed cough, the controlled shivers of a shipmate nearby, these would have become familiar cues, understood, without articulation. This shared experience forged a deeper, almost primal bond. Dr. Johann Schild, a sociologist studying group dynamics in extreme environments, emphasizes how unspoken collective understanding often forms in conditions of severe hardship, fostering a sense of solidarity that transcends individual discomfort. Even in sleep, or the fitful attempts at it, the awareness of this shared suffering would have been present. This shared silence offered a paradoxical comfort. While each individual bore their own physical and mental burdens, the knowledge that everyone else was enduring the exact same struggle created a unique form of tacit support. It meant that a groan of pain or a shiver was not met with irritation, but with a silent acknowledgement of shared fate. This psychological connection, this implicit understanding of mutual suffering, could potentially reduce some of the isolating terror of the winter night. It allowed individuals to feel part of a greater whole, to draw strength from the collective will to survive. This unspoken camaraderie, while not erasing the physical torments, provided a vital emotional anchor, a communal peace within the otherwise chaotic and comfortless environment, perhaps allowing for those fleeting, fractured moments of sleep to become slightly less terrifying, slightly more bearable. In the desperate search for even a sliver of warmth, the medieval pirate ship occasionally offered a fleeting, highly controlled luxury, a smouldering fire pit. While far from providing comprehensive heating to the entire vessel, this small, contained source of warmth became a focal point for what little comfort could be found, a brief respite from the pervasive, soul-chilling cold that gnawed at their very bones. Its presence, however limited, directly impacted their ability to brace for or recover from precious minutes of sleep. Such fire pits, often made of stone or clay-lined areas in the center of the open deck, were primarily for cooking. Evidence from the Gokstad ship, c. 900 AD, for instance, includes a stone hearth, clearly indicating its presence on certain vessels. During severe winter weather, or when anchored in sheltered coves, these fire pits might have been brought below deck or placed under a temporary awning to offer some localized warmth. However, fire on a wooden ship was an immense risk. The danger of accidental ignition meant any fire was carefully monitored and kept small, often just glowing embers rather than a roaring blaze. Dr. Gareth Williams, an expert in Viking ships, notes the inherent paradox. The very tool for survival was also the greatest threat to a wooden vessel at sea. Yet, even a small fire emitted enough radiant heat to make a significant difference in a deeply cold environment. Sailors would huddle around it, warming their hands, drying damp clothes with extreme caution, and potentially preparing a hot meal or drink. This concentrated warmth, though temporary and localized, could bring enough relief to relax muscles stiff from cold, numb fingers and penetrate the layers of damp clothing, allowing for a fleeting period of genuine physical relief. In these moments, perhaps a pirate could finally drop his guard, the tension easing enough for body and mind to consider rest. This strategic, though dangerous application of fire provided a brief, precious window of comfort, a temporary physical and psychological thaw that made the ensuing struggle for sleep marginally less agonizing. In the rhythmic, oftentimes brutal cycle of a medieval pirate's winter voyage, the ritual of the day's end, however meagre, offered a psychological anchor. This wasn't a time for relaxation, but a structured transition, a brief moment of predictable routine that provided a brief respite from the ceaseless cold and chaos. It was within this familiar sequence that the elusive hope of sleep, however fractured, might finally be pursued. Upon the fading of the short winter daylight, or as darkness descended and watches were set, there would be a communal shift from active duties to a more passive, defensive stance against the night. The most immediate concern, naturally, was often food. While meals were rudimentary, consisting of heavily preserved and often unappetizing fare, the act of distributing and consuming sustenance provided a focal point. Hot gruel, weak ale, or a portion of boiled salted meat, however simple, offered caloric intake essential for maintaining body heat and some measure of internal warmth against the frigid external air. This shared meal, even in silence, reinforced the communal bond discussed previously. Dr. Anne-Marie Hegman's research on traditional food culture in Nordic societies emphasizes the social and psychological importance of meals, even subsistence ones, in reinforcing social order and providing a sense of normalcy in harsh environments. Following this, the crew would prepare their meager sleeping arrangements. This often involved finding their designated space, huddling together with companions, and arranging personal bedding, a wool blanket or animal skin. This preparation, however minimal, constituted a nightly routine. The very act of preparing for sleep, even when true sleep was elusive, established a mental boundary between the active day and the passive night. It allowed spirits to be lowered, vigilance to be internalized, and the body to begin its agonizing descent into fitful rest. This nightly ritual, a predictable sequence of actions, created tiny islands of psychological stability in a sea of overwhelming uncertainty and discomfort, momentarily distracting from the cold and allowing the exhausted body a chance, however slight, to succumb to its pressing need for unconsciousness. After weeks or months at sea, battling the relentless winter, the memory of land, its stability, warmth, and quiet comforts, would begin to fade for the medieval pirate, becoming a wistful echo rather than a vivid reality. This psychological distancing from the familiar comforts of home further exacerbated their sleep deprivation, as the mental blueprint for restorative rest found no correspondence in their punishing present. For sailors of the early medieval period, life on land centered around the longhouse, a communal dwelling with a central hearth that provided constant warmth, a place for cooking, eating and sleeping on raised platforms often insulated with straw or animal skins. Archaeological reconstructions of Viking-age longhouses, such as those at the Lofoten Viking Museum in Norway, vividly illustrate these environments. Smoke-laden but warm, with the murmuring sounds of family and community. This was the blueprint for comfortable sleep, a stable, warm, dry and relatively secure place, a stark contrast to a rolling, freezing, damp ship deck. Dr. Helene Brembeck, a scholar of domestic life in medieval Scandinavia, emphasizes the longhouse hearth as the physical and emotional center of family life. Deprived of this fundamental comfort, the pirate's mind would struggle to achieve the signals necessary for deep sleep. The body, constantly fighting cold, anticipating motion, and processing threatening sounds, remained in a perpetual state of alert. The psychological impact of being disconnected from the familiar stimuli associated with safety and comfort cannot be underestimated. Sleep is not merely a physical state. It is deeply intertwined with a sense of security and belonging. Without the sensory cues of a warm home, the steady crackle of a fire, the feel of a dry bed, the absence of threatening sounds, the brain might actively resist succumbing to unconsciousness. This fading memory of a truly comfortable sleep, replaced by the grim reality of the ship, became another burden carried by these hardy mariners, haunting their fitful dreams and making true rest an almost mythical aspiration. Beyond all the tangible hardships, the most crushing burden on the medieval pirate's sleep during winter was the relentless weight of uncertainty. Each night at sea was a profound gamble, a roll of cosmic dice where the stakes were often life itself. This pervasive unpredictability, a constant low-grade hum of anxiety, fundamentally undermined any profound psychological peace necessary for deep, restorative sleep. The unpredictable nature of winter weather in the North Sea region is well documented. Storms could materialize with terrifying speed, capable of capsizing vessels or driving them onto unseen shoals. Unlike later eras with more advanced meteorological prognostication, medieval mariners relied on folk wisdom and immediate signs, offering little time for preparation. Furthermore, the risk of encounters, be it with hostile coastal defenses, other pirate crews, or even treacherous ice floes, remained ever present. The historical records of naval campaigns and piratical exploits in the Heimskringla and other sagas are replete with accounts of ships lost unexpectedly to weather, disease, or sudden conflict. Professor Alex Wolff, a historian specializing in early medieval Northern Europe, emphasizes the constant state of low-level warfare or raiding that permeated these societies, making any sea journey a potentially dangerous endeavor. For a pirate crew, every creak of the hull in the night, every shift in the wind, every unexpected splash against the side of the ship could signal a catastrophic turn of events. Sleep, by its very nature, demands a surrender of control, a temporary relinquishing of vigilance. But when surrounded by such profound and immediate uncertainties, that surrender was almost impossible. The brain, hardwired for survival, would likely keep an individual in a state of hypervigilance, preventing the deeper stages of sleep where conscious awareness is most diminished. This chronic activation of the stress response system, the constant adrenaline and cortisol, would have profoundly disrupted sleep architecture, leading to fragmented, shallow rest, punctuated by brief awakenings whenever a perceived threat occurred. The weight of uncertainty transformed sleep from a natural necessity into a perilous act, a gamble taken anew with each passing night on the brutal winter waves. Beyond the grand external battles of man against nature, the medieval pirate attempting to sleep during winter also fought a continuous, intimate war against smaller, unseen adversaries. Vermin, rats, mice, lice, and fleas were not merely an inconvenience. They were persistent, biting companions that contributed significantly to the discomfort, hygiene issues, and sleep deprivation aboard the ship. Their unseen presence ensured that even moments of stillness were often disturbed. The conditions on board a longship, filled with stored provisions, animal hides, and the constant presence of human bodies, created an ideal habitat for various forms of vermin. Rats and mice, resourceful scavengers, would burrow into cargo, gnaw at ropes, contaminate food, and breed rapidly in the darkness of the lower decks. Their nocturnal movements and persistent scratching and scurrying sounds would disrupt attempts at sleep, especially in the close and confined quarters. Evidence from later historical accounts of seafaring, corroborated by archaeological finds of rodent remains in shipwrecks, confirms their ubiquitous presence. Entomologist Dr. Hannah Mumby details how quickly infesting insects and rodents could establish themselves on wooden vessels. Even more insidious were the parasites that fed directly on humans. Lice and fleas, thriving in unwashed clothing and communal sleeping arrangements, would cause relentless itching and skin irritation. Already battling the cold and damp, the constant maddening itch of parasitic bites would have made falling into and staying in a deep sleep an almost impossible feat. While practices like nitpicking or using fine-toothed combs, archaeologically evidenced, existed, these were largely ineffective against widespread infestations in such an environment. Each new bite, each phantom itch, would rouse the individual from their fitful sleep, perpetuating the cycle of sleep deprivation. The presence of vermin was not just a testament to poor sanitation. It was an active and relentless tormentor, ensuring that even in the embrace of unconsciousness, the pirate could never truly escape the incessant, biting realities of their grim winter journey. In the face of relentless cold, damp, disease, and the constant threat of death, the medieval pirate crew, like all humans in extreme conditions, would eventually deploy a powerful, if grim, psychological defense: humor. This wasn't necessarily cheerful banter, but rather a dark gallows humor, a shared jesting about their collective misery, acting as a vital shield against the corrosive grip of despair. While it couldn't provide physical warmth or improve sleep directly, it offered a crucial mental buffer against conditions that would otherwise shatter the human spirit. Evidence from historical and ethnographic studies of groups undergoing extreme hardship, from polar explorers to soldiers in combat, consistently points to humor as a universal coping mechanism. In a context where individual agency was often severely limited, where physical comfort was non-existent, and where death was a constant companion, finding something, anything to laugh at, however darkly, provided a momentary release from tension. The sagas, while primarily heroic narratives, also contain flashes of sharp, often sardonic wit and boastful self-deprecation that speaks to this cultural trait. For example, the Erbigja saga contains instances of characters exchanging insults and jests even in perilous situations. Anthropologist Dr. Mary Douglas's work on humor suggests that it functions as a social corrective and a means to acknowledge and simultaneously transcend difficult realities. Imagine a group of pirates huddled together below deck, shivering, perhaps covered in sea lice, their stomachs rumbling from meagre rations. A particularly vile smell, an accidental slip, or the shared recognition of a truly appalling meal could spark a moment of shared bitter laughter. Such instances, however brief, served to lighten the oppressive atmosphere, to reaffirm group cohesion, and to temporarily externalize their suffering. This grim humor, by acknowledging the absurdity of their predicament, helped to normalize it, making it slightly more bearable. Such moments of psychological release, though not directly inducing sleep, could break the cycle of anxiety and tension, helping the mind to relax sufficiently to perhaps snatch some minutes of less troubled unconsciousness. Humor, in this context, was a testament to the crew's resilience, a shield against the creeping despair that threatened to consume them, a shared human warmth protecting the fragile spark of the mind. Paradoxically, amidst the cacophony and ceaseless motion, life on the open sea, especially during the long winter nights, could also induce a form of sensory deprivation. Once accustomed to the immediate overwhelming stimuli of the ship and the storm, the absence of varied, familiar, and comforting sensory input from land played its own subtle yet profound role in disrupting the medieval pirate's sleep. The vast, undifferentiated expanse of the ocean, devoid of landmarks or diverse natural sounds, fostered a deep psychological isolation. On land, the human brain is constantly processing a rich tapestry of sensory information. The sight of trees and buildings, the sound of birds and distant human activity, the smell of earth and vegetation. At sea, this intricate web of input is drastically reduced. Beyond the confines of the ship, particularly at night, the world often shrinks to an undifferentiated expanse of dark sky and dark water. There are no familiar points of reference, no varied sounds of the natural world, no changing sense of an evolving terrestrial landscape. Research into sensory deprivation, even in controlled modern environments, shows its profound impact on cognitive function, leading to disorientation, hallucinations, and severe disruptions to circadian rhythms. Dr. John Lilly's pioneering work in sensory isolation tanks demonstrated how quickly the mind can generate its own stimuli in the absence of external input. For a pirate forced to sleep in such an environment, the brain, starved of its usual grounding information, would struggle to anchor itself. The deep, black ocean, the monotonous roar of waves, the unchanging cold, and the pervasive darkness would leave the mind feeling adrift, unmoored from reality. The body might be exhausted, but the mind, in its quest for meaning and input, would remain subtly active, preventing the deep, restorative sleep that requires a sense of security and perceptual stability. This profound sensory monotony, especially after the immediate threats were accounted for, could itself become a psychological burden, transforming the vastness of the sea not just into a physical challenge, but into a form of existential quietude that actively worked against the biological need for deep, unconscious rest. For all the formidable adversaries faced by medieval pirates during brutal winter months, the cold, the damp, the hunger, the constant threat of death, and the crushing weight of sleep deprivation itself, the ultimate testament to their survival lay in the unyielding resilience of the human spirit. This innate capacity to endure, to adapt, and to find purpose even in the most desolate circumstances burned like a beacon in the blizzard, allowing them to push beyond perceived limits. Human beings are not designed for prolonged sensory deprivation, extreme cold, or chronic sleep loss. Yet the historical record is replete with examples of individuals and groups enduring, and even thriving under such conditions. The ability of the pirate crews to continue functioning, to perform complex and dangerous tasks, to maintain their vessels and to sustain themselves speaks volumes about this inherent human capacity. The body, as discussed, adapts through desensitization. The mind, however, finds strength in purpose, in camaraderie, and in the sheer animalistic will to live. Dr. Alistair MacLeod, a psychologist specializing in extreme environments, highlights that the human element, particularly group cohesion and leadership, is often the most critical factor in survival against overwhelming odds. The very act of seeking out winter voyages, knowing the immense risks and discomforts, suggests a profound drive, whether for wealth, reputation, or simply the thrill of it. This underlying motivation provided a powerful counterforce to the debilitating effects of sleep deprivation and the elements. Even in their fitful, fragmented sleep, the mind likely processed strategies, remembered past successes, or envisioned future triumphs, offering a form of mental sustenance. Their survival, despite the chronic lack of restorative rest, was not due to an immunity to human needs, but an extraordinary capacity to override them. The brutal winter was a crucible, forging a deeper understanding of human endurance, and revealing that even when sleep was denied, the spirit found ways to persist, a silent, unyielding declaration against the crushing despair of the sea. After months of ceaseless struggle against the brutal grip of a medieval winter, the pirates' world began, imperceptibly, at first, to shift. The true climax of their desperate endurance wasn't a sudden event, but a gradual, subtle transformation, the first glimmer of thaw. This was the whisper of relief, a slow retreat of the pervasive cold that promised a loosening of winter's iron hold, and with it, the distant hope of finally achieving restorative sleep. The change manifests in myriad small ways, often before significant temperature increases. The sun, though still low in the sky, begins to gain a fraction more strength, and its appearances grow more frequent. The days, almost imperceptibly, lengthen by a few minutes each passing week. The ice that had coated ropes and decks might not form as thickly overnight, or might melt slightly faster in areas exposed to daylight. The wind, while still biting, loses some of its cutting edge, becoming less a razor and more a blunt instrument. Climatological data for the northern latitudes in the early medieval period confirm these subtle but crucial shifts as winter transitions into early spring, typically from late February into March. Dr. Astrid E. J. Lundberg, a paleoclimatologist, notes that even minor increases in average daily temperatures, coupled with increased solar radiation, have profound effects on the extent and persistence of sea ice and frost. For the hyper-attuned senses of a seasoned pirate, these minute changes would be profoundly significant. The slight lessening of the cold's bite, the hint of damp wool drying a little more thoroughly below deck, the less frequent groans of ice against the hull. Each small sign would feed the powerful psychological and physiological anticipation of true spring. This early thaw didn't erase the cumulative sleep debt, nor suddenly make conditions comfortable. It acted more as a physiological signal, a subtle easing of the body's defensive posture against extreme cold, offering a preliminary yet critical step towards a future where deep, untroubled sleep might once again become possible. It was the first quiet note in the receding symphony of suffering. Even as the first whispers of spring offered relief, the brutal medieval winter left an indelible mark on those who survived it at sea. The scars were both visible and invisible, physical reminders, and deep-seated psychological imprints, a testament to the extraordinary endurance required to navigate such an unforgiving environment. These lingering effects, particularly the profound sleep debt, would not vanish with the melting ice, but would take weeks, if not months, to truly alleviate. Physically, the toll was obvious. Many would bear the evidence of frostbite, discolored toes, fingers, or extremities, some perhaps partially lost. Chronic joint pain, exacerbated by damp and cold, would persist long after the voyage. Skin infections, rashes, and the lingering effects of malnutrition, such as weakened teeth or visible deficiencies, would be common. Bioarchaeological analysis of skeletal remains from coastal communities of the period often reveals higher incidences of arthritis and stress-related bone markers, consistent with a life of hard manual labor and environmental exposure. Dr. Anne Marie Williams, a bioarchaeologist, frequently correlates such conditions to occupational hazards of historical seafarers. The body's immune system, constantly battling cold and disease, would be depleted, leaving individuals vulnerable to further illness, even on dry land. Psychologically, the winter's impact would be equally profound. The chronic sleep deprivation accumulated over months would result in a prolonged period of recovery. Even in a warm, comfortable bed, true restorative sleep might initially be elusive, interrupted by the body's ingrained hypervigilance, phantom sensations of cold or motion, or recurring stress dreams. The sheer exhaustion, a pervasive mental fog, would likely persist for some time, affecting cognitive function, mood, and overall energy levels. However, against this backdrop of suffering, the act of having survived the winter voyage at sea would also forge an unparalleled sense of resilience and harden camaraderie. These scars, both physical and mental, were not merely injuries, they were badges of honor, proof of unimaginable endurance. They were a living testament to the human capacity to persist, even when deprived of the most fundamental comforts, including the profound necessity of sleep, against the overwhelming might of the medieval winter sea.